So today's our last day. So we're wrapping up. And I want to give you a foundation for understanding what's happening today in the art world. Hopefully, after today, you can look at anything and have some idea like where this came from, why this person is doing this thing. Teaching a course in postmodern art is really difficult compared to teaching modern, or frankly compared to teaching anything else, because it isn't one thing, it isn't two things, it isn't 50 things, it's hundreds of things that are all happening at the same time. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today, is sort of how it differs from sort of the modern world. So let's sort of review modernism. First of all, attempts to identify and define modernism begin in the 80s. As I said last time, changes begin happening in the 60s, but it's not until the 80s that someone kind of looks up and says, wait a minute, things have changed. Things are different. And then they start analyzing it and trying to understand what changed. So that's why we're dealing with changes that happened in the 60s, but everybody's analyzing them in the 80s, because that's what it takes. It takes a generation. It takes about 20 years distance, and no one can understand their own world. You just simply can't understand what you're sitting in the middle of. You need some distance to be able to step back and look at it. So what we talked about so far, like through this whole class, this is what we've seen modernism being. We saw how things changed with various revolutions and patronage change. This is kind of a sequence of events that gets us through the modern world. So when patronage changes, who art was made for changed, and that's huge. It's not made for this dominant aristocracy anymore. Not that they're not still out there. They're still out there today, but they're not the principal voice anymore. At the same time, industrialism creates a middle class, and that middle class has power. And as they have more and more power, art is increasingly made for them. Socialism comes along as a direct result of industrialism / capitalism. Socialism happens at the same time, and that drew everyone's attention to sort of the working class and the plight of the working class. And that changed what became acceptable for art. And we saw that in the 19th century with new kinds of subjects of working class people. Of course, it was controversial, but it started at the idea that, nothing is too low to be art. Remember, that was the controversy when you saw people, digging ditches in a work of art. I mean, the argument was, well, they're too lowly, they shouldn't be in a work of art. But no, they weren't. That was the other argument. So what is acceptable in art began changing. And most of this is so far as 19th century. In the 20th century, we saw this conscious search for finding new forms, this really setting, how do I find new forms? What kinds of forms? And by that I mean, what kinds of marks do I make? What kinds of shapes? What kinds of colors? What is it that's going to define the modern world? So we saw cubism, we saw fauvism, we saw constructivism, surrealism. All those are searches for form. And increasingly, it was framed as a kind of heroic quest. I'm going to find the new form. Well, you're wrong. This is the new form. Then somebody else comes along and says, no, that's not right. This is the new language. And think of all those Russian constructivists. That's what they were really searching for. So the avant-garde took on this conversation, this back and forth conversation about a few very narrow topics. What should art be? How do we express our world? And it's all framed in not only the idea of a heroic quest, but the idea that this is progress, that I'm changing, this is new, we're doing something different because this is progress. And then the next person says, no, I'm changing, this is something new, this is progress. This is all modernism we're talking about. So modern art was defined by a very narrow range of voices, predominantly white European male. That's what modernism was. In fact, modernism was more masculine than any movement before. Women fared worse in the modern period than they did in the 19th century, than they did in the 18th century, and going back. I mean, it was very exclusionary as a movement. And we know that it was really fairly elevated topics. We've been talking about this for like 3 months. You know, we've been focusing on pretty elevated themes. So that's modernism. So what happens in the 80s? Come on. People look around and said, wait a minute, something's different. Things began changing in the 60s, which they recognized later. And what they recognized is, here are some of the things that changed that helped define the postmodern world. People began to introduce imagery from popular culture. And we're going to talk about each one of these 6 things separately, and we'll look at works of art that do these things. So instead of high art, popular culture, it's something we've never seen in art before. And I'll define what that means, and we'll take a look at that. And that's a huge difference. When popular culture moves into the realm of fine art, it's very different from the sort of elevated subjects we've seen before. And of course, that's going to be controversial. They began to expand the artistic voice. This is really important in order to become more inclusive. Many voices, many audiences. When this begins to happen, some people are going to see this as, you know, doom and gloom, like the worst thing that could happen is all these other voices. What's going to happen is art's going to lose its central focus. Modernism was very centrally focused. At any given moment, there were maybe 1 or 2 at the most primary voices that were speaking about art. You know, during the 20s and 30s, we looked at constructivist approach, we looked at the surrealist approach. That's only 2 voices. That's not a lot. We're going to see hundreds of voices. And not only do I mean speaking about many different things artists never talked about before, but many different people doing it. And we'll see what this has to do with the feminist movement, African-American art, Latino art. All sorts of people begin making art and speaking about the world they live in who never had access to art in the modern period. All of these people were pushed to the margins. They were marginalized. We looked at a few women artists, but even then, those women were marginalized. They weren't allowed in the middle. You know, they weren't really part of what was going on. And so particularly, we'll see how important the women's movement was in that change. They're going to start problematizing the art object. Now, what does that mean? They're going to turn the definition of art into a problem to be discussed. Now, nobody thought that was a problem before. I know what a work of art is. It's this painting, it's that sculpture. That was never a question. But that's now going to be problematized, and they're going to even explore the idea of dematerialization. Maybe there isn't even an art object. Maybe I don't have to make some permanent thing to be an artist or to make art. So, and that's not totally new. There is one person who was doing that 50 years before this, and his name was Marcel Duchamp with his ready-mades. And we're going to talk about how influential he is on postmodern art. They're going to start to engage with and confront socio-political issues. Now, it's not that artists didn't talk about what was going on in their world previously, but rarely did they put it in your face and attempt to confront you aggressively with what's going on in the world. And they're certainly going to do that. So of all these, I would say that's not totally a new idea, but it's certainly one that dominates the postmodern world. They're going to explore new strategies for engaging with identity. You know, identity is a major theme in the postmodern world, but it's a different kind of identity because the global environment is going to also affect postmodern art. Globalization has a huge impact on art. Identity is going to shift from being about me to being about us. People are going to identify with various groups. And we're going to have a new understanding of what that means, group identity. We all function in a world as members of many different groups, and we're sort of different people in different groups. I mean, when you're with your family, you have one identity. When you're with these friends, you have another identity. When you're on this committee doing some good work, you have a different identity there. And we tend to today move pretty fluidly through these different group identities that we all have. So identifying with a group is going to be very important. And then, of course, engage with global politics. This is sort of the new world that we live in, and we're going to see that as well. So let's talk about popular culture first. What is popular culture? It's a term that's used a lot that people don't always understand. It's popular not in the sense of well-liked. It doesn't mean popular meaning people all like this thing. It's from the Latin word populus, which means of the people. Popular culture means the culture of the masses, the culture of the people. And it's just the opposite of high culture. High culture is an elite thing at the top of the pyramid, and it assumes the people up there all interact and communicate because they all have a very narrow knowledge and interest, but a very deep interest in knowledge. So there's an elitist quality to sort of so-called high culture. At the bottom of the pyramid, at the very widest point, is popular culture, the culture of the masses. And in that culture, everybody understands what you're talking about. I mean, if I want to make a work of art and speak about one particular philosophical point of view, I'm going to be way up there at the top of the pyramid, and very, very few people are going to understand what I'm talking about. You happen to be sort of in the same group as me to understand what this philosopher means. But if I want to talk about McDonald's hamburgers, who doesn't know what I'm talking about? I mean, not just here, but globally, you know what I'm talking about. So that's what I mean by you're dealing with imagery and ideas that have the broadest possible understanding, and they've never been part of sort of fine art before. This sort of emphasis, number one, emphasizes the sameness, how we're all alike, rather than uniqueness. I mean, if I'm talking about this one philosopher's point of view, that's a very unique experience, and few people will have that experience. But if I'm talking about McDonald's, I'm saying, boy, we're all alike, aren't we? There's something just in that idea that speaks of sameness or shared cultural experience. I can't think of a better example than McDonald's. Leveling experience, a leveling of experience in a consumer-driven culture. That idea of consumer-driven culture is an idea that comes out in the 60s. The 60s is the period post-war now, where 50s we're still dealing with World War II issues, and before 60s is the beginning of a new world, and it's a recognition of the consumer-driven world. It's the great decade of Madison Avenue and advertising, and the sophistication of imagery in the 60s was not in the hands of fine artists, it was in the hands of the advertising industry. And fine artists learned a lot from that, and a lot of artists came from the commercial art world. Mass communication and Marshall McLuhan. I want to talk briefly about him and his essay, The Medium is the Message. Marshall McLuhan was one of these people in the 60s who was the social critic. He was the person who was writing, talking, and really seeing the future in a way that nobody else can. His famous essay, The Medium is the Message, was in his book called Understanding Media from '64. If you ever find that book anywhere, highly recommend getting it. It's a series of little essays. You really want to understand social context. The book is Understanding Media. And the essay, one of the essays in that book was The Medium is the Message. There's actually a lot on YouTube. There are even videos of Marshall McLuhan talking. I mean, it's really interesting. What he talked about is mass media and how that has changed the way we interact with the world. Now, first of all, we have to understand in the 1960s, he's talking about television. He has no conception of the internet, I mean, which is what's really interesting about this, is just looking at television, he was already seeing what he called the leveling or sameness of human experience. And what's interesting, and this was an idea of the 60s that a lot of people were talking about, what's interesting is what he's talking about is, and again, hopefully many of you will remember this, and my former students didn't know what the heck I was talking about, but I can remember when television was local and when you first started having national television networks. For the first time, people all over this country could watch the same thing. And you had 3 networks. So you had 3 choices for news, you had 3 choices for entertainment, you had 3 choices for advertising. And it was a moment in time when we were connected across this country in a way we never were before or after. And so he's talking about how that leveling of experience is creating this sameness in how we interact with the world, how we think, etc. But what's fascinating is what's happened post-McLuhan, which is the internet, which has taken us right back to where we were before. Because now we have so many choices that, in fact, once again, we're now all watching different things. Now you have dozens of news networks to watch, and people are picking and choosing. And so none of us are seeing the same thing. We're all getting totally different stories that are biased depending on which outlet we choose to follow. And it's created incredible divisiveness. So where television unified us, the internet is dividing us. I mean, in some ways we're unified, in other ways we're divided, especially when you think of news. We couldn't be more divided today. And one reason is because of the internet and the fact that we can now pick and choose what news we want to watch. And so we get 100 different stories. Everybody's hearing different stories. So I think McLuhan, I think it's a moment when people need to go back. I think this is a prime moment. Let's go back and dig up Marshall McLuhan. Let's read him again. Let's think about what he's saying. And let's think about it in the context of what's happening right now. So I highly recommend reading Marshall McLuhan. But the kind of sameness he's talking about is what's influencing pop culture and pop art. Another thing that was talked about in the 80s a lot, trying to understand the difference between the modern art and postmodern art comes from an essay in a book by art historian / critic named Rosalind Krauss. And Rosalind Krauss was a very important voice in the 80s. And one of the things she wrote about was the grid, the idea of what she saw at that time as the difference between a way a modernist sees the world and the use of a grid. A grid is, first of all, a model. It's an analog or a model for how people see the world. So she used this as a way of arguing how people saw the world differently in the modern era and the postmodern era. She looked at Mondrian, the essence of modern art, and saw it as what she called a relational grid or a hierarchical grid. And what she means is all of the squares and spaces in that grid are different. There's a hierarchy there. Some are bigger, some are more important, some are smaller. And as I talked about at the time, it becomes about balance, finding this balancing act. And the imagery, the forms are a metaphor for that. And she sees the previous era as really being about that, a delicate balancing act, where in the postmodern world, what seems to dominate in art, and it's true, these grids do dominate these 2 periods of time. She sees the non-relational grid or the non-hierarchical grid. And Warhol is a perfect example of that, where now, yes, it's a grid, but every grid is the same. It's identical. So there's no hierarchy, there's no system of values, there's no reference to a value system, and therefore there's no value distinctions to be made. And she related that to cultural relativism, which is sort of the bad word in the 60s and 70s. We moved into an age of cultural relativism where people stopped having values. It's like cultural relativism is when you look at different aspects of culture or different cultures and say, well, they're all the same, they're all equal. It's the fallout of colonialism. Colonialism in the 19th and 20th century was an era when people could look at the world and just make these distinctions about good and bad. They just, we're good, you're bad. This is right, that's wrong. I mean, it's not a good world to live in, but it was a clear world. The modern age had clarity to it. It may have been, racist and sexist and all these other things, but people were clear on what they believed and what they thought was right and what they thought was good. And we began after World War II in the 60s, moving into what is referred to as cultural relativism, where we could look at one culture and say, yeah, they do this, but that's part of the culture, and that's just as good as this culture. So, saying this culture in another part of the world is just as good as our culture, well, that's a good thing, right? Because that's not colonialism. We're not making judgments that we're better than other people. But at the same time, it led to the rejection of making value judgments of any kind. And so whatever system you're in, there are good and bad parts of it. One isn't any better than the other. Well, now I'm expressing a relativist point of view myself by just saying that, but I can't help it. I'm a postmodern person, so my head is already there. But if your head was once back in the modern period, you might be able to see a difference. So it's an absence of hierarchies. I personally framed that. Once I started teaching all this stuff, I began framing it in a context that I thought my students could understand, which was the idea of an analog world versus a digital world, because it's the same model. Mondrian's is an analog world where the forms he's creating parallel the ideas he's communicating. One square is bigger than another, one square is smaller than another. That's a visual model for the ideas, where Warhol does not. I usually use the clock as a reference because an analog clock, the hands turn around in a circle for a reason. That's analogous to the passage of time. It's analogous to the movement. I'm going to say the movement of the sun. We know the earth moves, but it's a turning of the sun. It's a visual analogy to the passage of time. Whereas a digital clock has no formal relationship to time at all. It's completely separated from time. And when I first studied computers, we learned about computer matrices. I mean, this was way back when you had to do punch cards, but you visualize each of these little bits and bytes of information. They're all the same size. They're all really identical, but they don't all hold the same identical information. It's treating different things as if they were the same, and they're not the same. They're differences. So that's, we've moved into a digital world where our forms do not represent values or qualities anymore. Let's talk about that specifically. In this Warhol, he's a very good example of pop art. He created it, he invented it, and he comes from the commercial art world. And what a work like this really speaks of is sameness. I think we've got ice dropping all over. That's the ice machine. Can we close that door, both those doors? We're going to hear ice crashing everywhere again. It's about the sameness of human experience. It could go on indefinitely in any direction. For Warhol, who comes from the commercial art world, people are consumers of images, and he's really treating us that way. Speaking about the sameness, I mean, if where do you actually see products like this or an image like this? Any store, just look at the shelves where you have these rows and rows of these identical products lined up in this kind of grid. This is consumerism at its best. And what he was really doing was sort of turning a mirror on the world. What this is not telling us is anything whatsoever about Andy Warhol. I mean, this couldn't be more impersonal. There's nothing personal about it, even though he liked to say, he ate a lot of Campbell soup. That's why he grabbed this particular thing, but he could have grabbed anything. And he does this sort of grid and with any sort of consumer object. So it really isn't about Campbell soup. He was just sort of joking about that. But again, it appeals to the lowest common denominator. Everybody understood it. Now he comes out with this in 1962, while the abstract expressionists were still working. Pop art was immensely popular. That's not why it's called that, but it really was immediately. People wanted to come out and see it. And one reason was because they recognized it. I mean, they just had a decade of Pollock and de Kooning and Newman and Rothko, and they didn't know what the hell was going on there. But suddenly, oh, I recognize that. It's a soup can. So there was an element of recognizability in his work as well. They're also consumer objects. They're objects of disposable culture. I think some of his more telling pieces are something like this, the Maryland diptych, where you have two-panel piece, and by calling it a diptych, he references religious imagery, because diptychs we associate with religious art of Renaissance or later. And of course, in 62, I believe she had just died. I'm not sure of the year, but I believe she had just died when he did this. And so we've got two halves. It's silk screening. He's using commercial techniques as well, like silk screening, which has never been part of fine art, and things like acrylic paints, which were also come from the commercial art world. So he photo transfers a photograph of Marilyn and then hand paints over it in acrylic paint. So by doing these images of Marilyn this way, he's equating her with these consumables that we see in his other work. So is he, saying she's a she was just a product that we consumed? I mean, there's all sorts of possible interpretations. The two sides, is he saying, is this like the mask Marilyn, the fake person? Because if you really look at the image, he does a lot of images of her. All he really has painted is her makeup and her hair. If you remove the lipstick, the eyeshadow, the mascara, the eyeliner, it's a blank face. There's really nothing there. So it's a mask. So is he saying, that's her? And then the black and white side, is that like her own personality? There's the point is there's a million ways to interpret this, but he's not actually telling you any of those things. It's just out there for you to interpret. Later artists who embrace popular culture, of course, is Oldenburg. And we're, of course, familiar with the shuttlecocks. What he uses popular culture images for is to make us really think about our place in the world. And he does this by playing with scale, by usually making oversized objects, or else taking an ordinary object and making it in a different material. He's got a bunch of typewriters that are made out of this soft plastic. He'll use big plugs that you plug into the wall. And the shuttlecocks are sort of playing with our scale, and the building becomes like the net that you're hitting them over. So he does a lot of public art, or he tried doing a lot of public art and was not successful at all. There's a few pieces, I think I mentioned this before, there's a few pieces in public spaces, but they're almost all museums or university grounds or something like that, not like corporate spaces, because people really reacted negatively to the frivolousness of them. They don't take them seriously.
I saw in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if it was public or if it was a gallery. I don't remember now.
Yeah, there are a few in public spaces.
Dinner fork or some.
Okay, yeah, there's a bunch of dinner forks. There are trowels, like garden trowels stuck in the earth. I love those. I think today it's not as controversial as it was in the 60s and 70s, because, we have a different sense. It's been long enough that this is not a shocking image to anybody anymore. But nonetheless, controversial in most places. His wife, Kuzi van Bruggen. Well, it was, let me see, when did she die? I don't have her date.
It's been a few years ago.
But she died. He's still alive, but she died not long. She was much younger than him too, like 20 years younger than him. So I'm not sure what she died of. Now, I'm just doing a quick run through on this because I get one day to do postmodernism. So I'm trying to give you an overview of the types of things rather than an in-depth on any one thing. I don't think we can overestimate the importance of the feminist movement on the direction of art. I think it's directly responsible for changes in the art world for many reasons. The women were the first artists to demand a voice. It was the women's movement that then triggered African Americans and LGBTQ artists and Latinos and every other possible group of people began having a voice in art. But it begins with the women's movement. They're the first ones to give attention. And it comes out of women art historians, first of all, and then women artists, women critics who began asking, where are all the women? I mean, like when I was an undergrad, there were no, I'm not going to say no, there might have been one or two women artists.
What sort of hours you worked with your child in your lap, etc. But anyway.
Carol, you need to turn your sound off.
Sorry, I'm listening to it. Just a second here.
Okay, so anyway, it began with looking for the lost women in history, and then that led to more women having a voice and the like. So it changes everything in terms of art. And there are many generations of feminist art. It's very complicated. This is the first generation of essentialists. Essentialism was the first attempt at feminist theory, and it dealt with the body, the female body. And it was really sort of looking at male art, masculine art, 5,000 years of basically phallic imagery. So let's look at the female body. So it started with the body, and that didn't last very long. It was, within 5 years, the next generation of feminists were out there complaining and screaming against that point of view. Essentialism is very much a taboo today. But at the time, it was the beginning, and nothing's more important than Judy Chicago's dinner party. It was really the first that speaks of everything that's happening here. This is a real size, it's this massive table with these 33 place settings. It's in a triangular form, which is seen as a symbol, a female symbol. And each of the 33 place settings are dedicated to specific women artists, not necessarily women artists, but women historically who were important. And then there are 999 other names of important women historically on the floor, the tile floors. You can see there are names all over them. The place settings, and this is a collaborative piece. It's Judy Chicago's design, but well over 100. And not all women. There were some men who worked on this piece as well, to make all the ceramic pieces and all of the embroidery and the sewing to put it all together. I'm just going to look at one place setting. This is a place setting for Artemisia Gentileschi, who, if you were with us way back when we did Western art, is a very important woman artist from the 17th century, a Baroque artist. If you take Western art, again, if I do that, we'll take a look at Artemisia Gentileschi. But everything in the design is very Baroque. It's meant to reference the 17th century, styles of the fabric and the plates and the like. Yeah.
She spoke at an art
Oh.
feature thing one time, and she talked, her main emphasis was on the collaboration of women as opposed to the lone artist in the studio.
Yeah, that's a very important part of this. What she's tapping into is the tradition of women to work collaboratively. In the modern period, you had this clear difference between fine art and craft, and women were typically relegated to the realm of craft. And women would often get together, things like quilting bees. This is a period where there was also a great revival of quilt making and fabric art, fiber arts, and all these things that had been sort of women's world. But yeah, the collaboration of the project was very important to her, because it was sort of tapping into, how women worked.
Where is this?
Well, at the moment, it finally has a home. It's in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. This was boxed up for decades because there was nowhere to display it. It's massive. And she had agreed to give it to any museum that would make a space for it. And finally, and in fact, in the 80s, such a bizarre decade, the 80s. Well, someday we're going to look back and see the 80s is just the weirdest decade. But this was when there were all these art controversies. You had censorship, the Congress was up in arms, they were withdrawing, they were refusing to fund any museums that show dirty art. I mean, it was a real attack. It was called the culture wars of the 80s. And it was a real attack on art. And Congress actually said they would deny funding to any school that showed this work. I mean, these are illegal things they can't do, but they were doing them anyway. Because some of the plates look like female genitalia. Abstractly, but nonetheless, that's dirty art. And, this went through the courts. And so it was boxed up for a long time till finally Brooklyn College they were building a new space and a new wing, and they built a whole wing just for this. So it finally.
How big is it?
Those are real tables. So just imagine, those big tables, that takes up a big space.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, you're going to need like Conover. I could see it in our space here, but it would need something pretty much that big. But it's such a key monument in art that it deserves that kind of space. Other early feminist art, Anna Mendieta, I love this piece. It's also essentialist. She's tapping into another idea that was very much first generation, and that was this sort of relationship between sort of the female body and the earth. This is where, the nature goddess and all women are nature goddesses and all this sort of stuff starts. And clearly she's tapping into that. Now that gets rejected very firmly, very quickly by feminists who absolutely hate being associated with the earth, Mother Nature and all of this stuff. But this 77, it hadn't quite hit yet. The Tree of Life, it's obviously what she's doing. She's linking the female body. But this is actually interesting in a number of ways. It also shows this new sort of complexity of media during this period. Remember when we looked at the abstract expressionists and talked about sort of Clement Greenberg and Hans Hofmann and some of these writers who saw art as being, modernism as being about the purity of the medium. Painting should be just painting. It shouldn't be anything else. It shouldn't be trying to tell a story. It shouldn't be trying to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. It's just painting. Sculpture should just be sculpture, etc. Well, this sort of impurity is what postmodernism is really all about. It's mixing of medias. In fact, what are we actually looking at? We're looking at a photograph, but it's not considered photography as fine art. She's not a photographer. So then what we're really looking at is a photograph that documents a performance piece. Is this performance art where that's her? I mean, so she covers herself in mud and then has the photo taken. So we're not even sure what medium it is. And that idea of documenting a performance is very much part of the postmodern world, sort of as performance art will be. So it's confusing. But if you look this up in a textbook, it's going to be under sort of something about feminist art, even though it is a photograph. You're not going to see it considered a photograph, as art. Photography as art is something else. This is documentation, but those lines are very blurred. Later artists by the 80s become a bit more sophisticated when they drop that sort of woman as nature thing and get into a lot more complicated ideas, rejection of essentialism and the whole mother goddess analogy. Emphasis on cultural construction of gender begins. Essentialism was about gender being rooted in the body. This is your body, you are this gender. But we all know now that's not the case. But even then, it was a recognition that it's not rooted in the body. At this time, they went extreme the other way and said, no, gender is constructed. It's completely constructed. From the minute you're born and they put a little blue bracelet on your wrist or a little pink bracelet, people start constructing and telling you what your gender is. It's sort of the opposite of being born that way. It's now completely constructed, which was sort of an extreme. And they began examining how culture constructs gender, and some people more directly, and often using visual language. Barbara Kruger is powerful. Her work is really quite powerful. This is a good example of one of the sort of black and white pieces. You rule by pathetic display, and you've got this knife with the water going over it. It's very suggestive. It's a disturbing image, but you don't know why. One reason it's disturbing is because of those words and the way they're cut out. You know, they're cut out and like as if it's like a ransom note. There's something about that format that's disturbing. And then the knife is, you know, she's just washing a knife, but there's something about it that's aggressive. So it's an aggressive language. You rule by pathetic display. Even the phrases and the statements are suggestive and aggressive in a way. Now, some are more obvious than others. In this, we don't need another hero. Appropriating sexist imagery. Image appropriation is something I want to talk about. I didn't talk about it with Warhol, but we could have there. Andy Warhol appropriated the Campbell soup can image. He didn't invent that image, he appropriated it, pre-existed. The idea of appropriating something that exists in culture, that is known from culture, is a very important early postmodern strategy. It's a way of taking on something that already has connotations and associations and using those. Now, what was referred to in the 70s and 80s as image appropriation is referred to today as copyright violation. You have to, they were very naive at that time and just, you know, took what they needed. And I guarantee you after the 80s and 90s, Warhol estate is sued by everybody. The lawsuits were crazy. Artists are much more sophisticated today, and the laws are clearer today in terms of what you can use, how you can do it. But for a while, this was a huge issue. It went to courts. There were major court rulings. The courts were not very sensitive to artists' claims about artistic expression, not when it violated copyright law. So here's another case of image appropriation. So it's an image that we would all recognize in some way. We don't need another hero. The other thing I want to point out is the use of color, you know, black and white color. The sharp reds and blacks that she uses are totally rooted and very consciously borrowed from the language of revolution. Particularly, you know, I'm thinking of things like, you know, the Russian Revolution. Remember those posters where you had red, black, big, straight edge, cut out forms? That's the language she's tapping into very, very consciously. I just find this just such an important image, the language of revolution. Your body is a battleground. And you know, this is a period where there's still a lot going on in the 80s about power over women's bodies. Abortion was still a major issue in the 80s. It hadn't quieted down for a while. And now look where we are today. And something like this, your body is a battleground. I mean, that could have been made yesterday. That image could be right out there speaking about the world that we live in. So it's a powerful image.
Hey, what's the medium in these? Are they photographs?
They're actually, what's interesting, she does some big pieces. She's done some commissions for museums and galleries where she'll cover the whole floors and the walls and the ceilings. But the majority of her work are things that were just put on t-shirts or matchbooks.
Well, I think the previous, the little boy, the little girl, and this.
Well, this was in several different ways. At one point, this was actually a big billboard. Was made as a big billboard size piece, but it also appeared in smaller forms. She intentionally kind of rejects traditional art medium formats. And many of these are just, I mean, I have a bunch of her, I used to have, I don't know where they are now, hoping to God they're buried in a box somewhere, and I didn't lose them when I moved, but I used to have a bunch of her matchbooks that you could just write, and you still can.
They're prints, I mean,
they're like Duchamp's Mona Lisa with the mustache. They were never made to be a single unique work of art. They're images that can be reproduced in any way you want them to be produced. And you can usually go online and buy her stuff just as t-shirts and whatever kind of format, sometimes postcards, but she's kind of unique in that. Not everybody was doing that or is still doing that, but thanks for asking the question. So yeah, this is what you want to be wearing around on a t-shirt or having it, because they're political. Her work's deeply political, and therefore she doesn't want it locked up on the wall in a museum where a handful of people see it. It should be out walking the streets or out where everyone could see it. Not long after women begin speaking about the world they live in, African American art begins as well. And the first generation, the 70s, is really quite different from later generations, as is feminist art. It changes dramatically. Appropriation of images is also a part of this early strategy. In the same way that women appropriated sexist imagery, African Americans appropriate racist imagery. And Betty Saar, I've heard her talk about this piece many times. She had no idea this was going to become the iconic work that it was. She didn't think of it that seriously at the time, but the reference to Aunt Jemima was very common, especially African-American women would often make references to Aunt Jemima because this is sort of one of the stereotypes that women often embrace. Interestingly, she's using the shadow box format, which is what we saw that with Joseph Cornell, that sort of old format that goes back to the Victorian period where people would display like collectibles and precious objects and hang them on the wall. In this case, the back wall has what was at that time in 72, the current image of Aunt Jemima that was on products. Now that image has changed many, many times. Clearly the figure in the middle who has a couple of guns, there's a pistol in one hand, there's a rifle there, and then the sort of nanny-like figure who's raising the white baby. These are cotton balls down here at the bottom. It's meant to be aggressive. It's meant to be, you can imagine how shocking this was in 72. And it wasn't sort of the white art public that was shocked. It was the Black audience. I mean, African Americans didn't know. I mean, this is racist image, and you got a Black woman making this racist image. But that was very much a moment in time. If you weren't there in the 70s, you wouldn't get it. But this was a thing. African Americans were doing all sorts of really racist things as a way of sort of taking back these words. Like if I take these words or these images and I take them over and control them, then they can't be used against me. It was really a powerful tool at the time.
How big is that?
That's like that, something like that. I don't have the dimensions, but it's about that size. So not huge. So I suspect the images are literally cut off of like boxes of Aunt Jemima pancake mix or whatever. So they're about that size. So that appropriation of racist imagery, and it was immensely controversial. So was Robert Colescott. Eat dem taters. Again, it's appropriating that language and mocking it in a way, sort of taking away its power. And you may or may not immediately recognize what this comes from. Exactly. He's appropriating a very, very famous work of Western art, The Potato Eaters by Van Gogh, and turning it into Eat Dem Taters with this racist imagery. I think Van Gogh, I think he's really kind of stereotyping those people himself. I think I always thought that was sort of an extreme image that he made, where showing these, it was a bit of a sort of social, whatever you call it. It's not racism, but he certainly was. Yeah.
Well, didn't he set out to be a minister to these people and they rejected?
Yeah. But I don't think he's intentionally trying to mock them, because he wrote about this. And, he says they're people of the earth. He's trying to show them as people of the earth. But there is a sort of superiority point of view that's coming in. And notice the role the words are playing now in the art. We've seen several pieces where there's text on the piece. Words are becoming a visual component.
Is this a Black artist?
Yes. Oh, yes. All these are African American artists. African American artists, by definition, are Black artists who speak about the Black experience. I've had students ask, well, why later we'll look at an African-American artist and say, why didn't you talk about him with African-American art? Well, because he's not speaking about the Black experience. Every woman doesn't make feminist art, and every Black artist doesn't make African-American art. It's about what they're speaking about and who they are as they speak. Oh gosh, a white person did this, we would have a serious problem. Yeah. His reference to Western cultures, this is the most important reference. Now, you recognize this? Oh, didn't I bring it in? Oh, there it is. I just got them out of order. It's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. In this case, is Demoiselles d'Alabama, vestidas, which means dressed or clothed. And what's intriguing is, if you remember, Picasso's piece is influenced by African art. And so you've got the that's cultural appropriation. Picasso was appropriating African culture without any understanding of what, or any concern as to what they actually meant in the culture. And so now Colescott's coming around and appropriating Picasso back again. It's sort of like taking back that power. Later artists begin speaking more by the 80s. They're speaking more about African-American life experience, something that really hasn't been talked about much. Faith Ringgold is still a major voice, although I'm not sure she's working all that much anymore. This is one from her quilt series. Now, I mentioned that there was a revival of quilt making that began in the 60s and really continues today as part of the women's movement, as part of sort of reviving traditional arts of women. And so using the quilt is making feminist references. I could have showed this in feminist art. I could have showed it here. In fact, that's the thing with so many of these different approaches to art we find in the postmodern world is, you could put them all together. Any work of art might tap into this, and then also popular culture, and then also this, and also that. They're not these exclusive, unique categories where every work fits. It's many different things are brought into it.
Is that a quilt?
It's a real quilt that she has painted over. And the Quilt Story series speak to memories from her life. She talks about why she embraces the quilt. She talks about how quilts were the repositories of a family's memory. And it's not just African-American families. It was like that in my family. I remember, quilts being handed down, and then you're told the story, like your great-grandmother did these, and then your grandmother added this on. And then, so it's generational. The other thing that, I taught in Western Kentucky. We were just down the road from Paducah, Kentucky, where the National Quilt Museum is located. Quilting is huge in that part of Kentucky. Everybody knows about quilts, but today is a very different quilt world than it was in the past. Today, you go to the fabric store and you buy these squares, right, to make quilts. But then, of course, quilts came from scrap fabric that was left over from clothes that you made. And I can remember seeing quilts that, here's a little piece of this dress my mother made for me when I was 5 or whatever. They're memories, they're repositories of generations of life. And those stories are passed on. And that's where her Quilt Story series comes from. It's that idea of quilts as memory. In this particular one, she calls it Tar Beach. And it's hard to see, but that there's an area up above where there's text. It's literally handwritten, and she's written out a whole story there about the scene and explains she grew up in Harlem. And Tar Beach was the name they gave to the roof of the building. It was tarred, and you go to Tar Beach means you're going up on the roof. It's as close as they're going to get to a beach. And she had just lots of fond memories of evenings when it was too hot to be inside. So you'd go sleep, people would go up and sleep on the roof, and different families and their friends would get together and they'd, eat. that's her and her little brother. And she talked about how they'd lay there and look up at the stars, and she'd imagine herself, and you can see her up there floating. She imagined herself floating above the bridge. I'm not sure what bridge it is, looking down on New York and looking down at all those tall buildings that she knew she would never see, that she would never be in. Like, it's like they're on another planet. They can look out and see the buildings, but it's another world. So it's a really personal story about memory and her experience. And that's, Faith Ringgold. And that's basically where it was moving, African-American art was moving at that time. The other artist I want to look at is Jean-Michel Basquiat, who's really one of the most famous of the male African-American artists of the 80s. In fact, he was like the star of the 80s. There was nobody more sought after, more popular. He was like the shooting star in the art world. Everybody wanted Basquiat, etc. He was from Brooklyn, and he started out as a graffiti artist, and graffiti really peaks in the 80s, and there were very specific styles and artists, and it really reached its peak. He's one of the few sort of street artists who successfully made the transition to gallery work and was very successful there. Most were not, but he kept the sort of raw graffiti-like quality of his work. People made a big deal about the fact that he wasn't really educated in art. And the truth is, he didn't go to art school, but he was quite educated in art. He spent a lot of time, he spent, much of his time in libraries reading about art. He was not a primitive, he's not someone who didn't know what art was, but he's speaking very much about the street and the experiences of the street in an African-American community. Horn Players is an homage, very much an homage to a couple of different people, Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. There are a lot of words, you can see Dizzy Gillespie, the reference to ornithology is a reference to Charlie Parker, who was known as the Bird, and I think one of his albums was called Ornithology. So it's very much about what matters, power structures. He really invented a whole language of imagery for his art. Crowns symbolized, I don't think there are any crowns in this one, but many of his, there's a crown that symbolizes sort of the street power, whoever's in power on the streets, and all sorts of images that were recognizable by using these wooden panels. There are 3 vertical wooden panels. They're almost like fences. So it's more like graffiti in terms of how he's depicting it. So he died very young, unfortunately, of a heroin overdose. It was a classic example of, too much fame too fast, and too much money too fast, and just sort of burned out, which was a huge loss. Who was one of his best friends, and this is the weirdest, they even did a lot of work together, was Andy Warhol. He was, you can't think of 2 more like really different people, but they were actually very good friends and collaborated on some work. It was weird work. It wasn't like a merging of styles. It was like this half looked like Warhol and this half looked like Basquiat. It was not. What do you have? Do you have images of his work?
Looking at a picture of him.
Oh, yeah. There's a really good movie, Basquiat, if you ever find it somewhere, of his life. And Jeffrey, gosh, what's his name? He's a real famous actor now. Played him, but really did it well. If you ever get a chance, I recommend that movie. I don't usually recommend movies, biopics about artists, but this is a good one. Okay, that was one type. Another type deals with the idea of the dematerialization of the art object. There are many artists also who begin making impermanent or temporary art, which emphasizes its conceptual nature to a great extent. The land art movement was and is still very important. Land art is basically you're literally moving and manipulating the land. That's very much an American style. Many of these other things are going to develop in Europe and in other places, but land art is very American. And that's because of sort of where it comes from, and Native American arts is a big influence on it. Robert Smithson, one of the most famous of the early artists who were interested in the idea of place and defining places. There's a political quality to the idea of place, investigating the sort of social cultural role of place. These are all site specific, meaning the specific place was chosen, the nature of the imagery itself relates to that place or space. It can't be moved anywhere else. It wouldn't be the same thing. This is his most famous piece. He died not too long after this, just a few years after this. This is on the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And he'd always been fascinated with that salt water because of what does and doesn't live in it. This is very saline, and there's only one kind of little entity that can live there. And when you see some of the pictures, they look really quite red. These are those little creatures that are kind of red. He always found salt water mysterious, almost mystical. And it really is when you think about it. You know, lakes are not supposed to be salty. And when you have an interior salt lake, that's a very ancient site. There's something about it. Often they have underground connections to the ocean. There's something mysterious about them. They're ancient, they're primal saltwater lakes. So Great Salt Lake has always drawn him. Also the salt crystals. Salt crystals have a spiral form to them. I'm not a chemist. I'm taking for granted that all the people I've ever read are right when they say that salt crystals have the spiral, but caveat, I've never looked. I'm assuming they're correct. So the spiral itself to him had a very ancient tradition. It's something that exists on the microscopic level, but also on the vast macroscopic level, because you think of spiral galaxies, there's something about a spiral as a form that's deeply rooted in the nature of existence in our universe. Spirals are tiny, tiny and huge, huge. So there's something kind of mystical about that, if you want to think about that. Now, the spot that he chose is a spoil land. They had the site itself had been the site of a mine, and it was spoil land, meaning it was already ruined and destroyed. A lot of land artists work with that kind of land, that it's going to need to be hauled away and redone and in the first place. So he's working with that. Now, the jetty is, to get a sense of scale, the width is about the width of a roadbed. So imagine that to be just about the width of a roadbed. So he would with a big dump truck, he'd fill it up and then back out and dump it, and then go fill it up again and back out a little further and dump it. So each time you dump it, you're creating a little more jetty that you can back out further and further. That's how it was made. He was very interested in the idea of entropy. Entropy, of course, is just the natural wearing away of everything. Everything, if it exists, is subject to entropy, everything that exists. So the idea of a temporary work of art. Now, he doesn't own this land. He took out a 20-year lease on this land, which means for 20 years he controlled it. After that, he didn't. So whatever happened, happened. You can already see along the edges, all that white, that's the salt crystals eating away at the rocks. Now, I've got a view here. One of the big influences on him, and many, not all, but many artists, were earthworks, Native American earthworks. That's the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. We know that many African-American groups made either effigy mounds or tomb mounds. And you can see the Great Serpent Mound is really famous, but there are many other mounds like that. So mound building in general influenced these artists to sort of make their mark on the earth, to sort of use the earth as a palette. And there you see it from the sky. You can actually see this on Google Earth. If you look the satellites, you can zoom in and see this really clearly, because it's back again. For a long time it was gone. Like by the 90s, I mean, there were 20 years or so, we just forgot about it. This is not easy to find. It's way, way off. It's not like you're going to drive by it naturally. And then somebody, went out to look for it one day, and it was back. The water had gone down again. And these are some pictures that one of my students sent me who had gone out to visit it. This is what it looks like today. That's all the salt of it. So it looks entirely different today, but it's back again in a different form. So who knows what's going to happen in the future?
Where would the financing come from to construct that thing in the first place? I mean, did you have these backers, or?
Generally, that's how it happens. Generally, sometimes a gallery, this wouldn't have been extremely expensive, but some are even more so. Today, it's often a gallery that backs you, and you would like have an exhibit. Like many of these artists, frankly, who make temporary art, do it intentionally to subvert the gallery system. They do it so there's nothing to sell. That's kind of the point. They don't want anything left over that could be sold or exhibited. And Smithson was one of those people. But the reality is you can't subvert the gallery system. Somebody's going to figure out a way to make money off that art. So what typically happens is there'll be like photographs or plans that they have that they will put up and exhibit and then sell those to raise money. That's what Christo did, and we'll look at him in a minute. But he would raise millions that way. This particular piece, I'm not 100% sure, but that's typically where the money comes from. Usually you have to somehow raise it in advance.
A lot of money to build that.
Yeah. Well, you need a dump truck. You need permission to use the land, and then a dump truck. You don't need a few hands to shovel.
One dump truck, it could be a lifetime.
Well, it would. Leanna should.
How big is it? How big is it?
Well, how big? Well, there's a person there for scale. That's all I really.
Yeah.
You sort of judge from that. It's good size. My favorite artist that makes temporary works is Andy Goldsworthy, and I adore Andy Goldsworthy. His work is absolutely incredible. I would give anything to be walking out in the woods someday and discover an Andy Goldsworthy. I mean, to me, that would just be heaven. We know him, of course, from the Walking Wall at the Nelson, but that's very different from sort of where he started out or most of his works. He never plans his works, these sort. Obviously the Walking Wall had to be very well planned, but these sort of things he does, these temporary pieces in nature, he goes out and he responds to what he finds. He responds to nature. He's very influenced by another artist, Richard Long, who was very well known, a British artist, and Goldsworthy's British as well, who would go just walking out and just make these big lines on the earth and just sort of make your mark. But Goldsworthy manipulates forms like this. So this is sort of just what he finds. I mean, every time I see these, I want to go out and make one. Every single time I want to go out to the park, find a bunch of rocks or feathers or leaves and just arrange them in a certain way, because it's so stunning. These ordinary things that you've stepped over a million times that you don't think about, but somebody sort of just organizes them in a way that makes you think entirely differently. So rowan leaves with whole, both of them are just, I think they're just very, very powerful, simple images that you could just come across, and then he just leaves them, photographed to document, and then that's it. And these are incredible as well. The arch from '87, I think that's just, doesn't it make you want to go out and do that? It just does. We should do that one day. Let's just all get together and we'll go out to a park somewhere and just move things around, see what we got. And the knotweed stalks, it's like a web, like a spider web. It has that translucency. And then the image behind it, I mean, it's part of the image. So these are another example. These are beautiful photographs, and they're going to be displayed as photographs because it really isn't just about the thing. The background does matter, and what's around it does matter. So it breaks that barrier between sort of performance art, conceptual art, photographic art as documentation. Powerful pieces. And Christo, we all know Christo, right? How many of you remember the wrapped walkways?
I had some pieces of it.
Yeah, I have pieces of it too. I was here then. This was that brief period when I lived here for about 9 years, back in the late 70s and mid 80s. The fabric, yeah, I have pieces of fabric.
Yellow.
It's beautiful fabric. It's actually one of his lesser known pieces. It doesn't get talked about very much, but I always talk about it because it's personal. It's not one of his most beautiful per se, but I remember what that looked like in the mornings when the sun would hit it, and it would just look like liquid gold, like pouring down the sidewalks. Christo began, I could go on and on about Christo, from Romania, escaped from the communist country and went to Paris. And he remembered, one of the things he remembered was collective acts, the idea of they would get all the school kids together and bust them out to sort of paint slogans and whatever. And he remembered the power of getting a lot of people together to go out and do something. So that was, these are really about the making of them. And like for 2 weeks, you get to remember that, and then they're gone. The temporary nature of the works is also very powerful. Anything temporary is going to be more powerful because it's going to be gone.
Wrapped walks in place else, mostly wrapped buildings.
And
that's more dramatic.
All sorts of the cliff sides and buildings, and we'll look at surrounded islands where he wraps the islands. Specific walkways, I can't think of any other thing like that you walked on. And I have my t-shirt too. I don't anymore. I lost it. But that was the 80s, was back when there was this fad for cutting off your shirts. It was like, it was a fad, what was it called? Ankle warmers were a fad, and cutting off the sleeves of your t-shirts was a fad, because that's what ballet dancers did, I guess. So I used to have one of those with the sleeves cut off. That was an 80s thing. It was very much an 80s thing. So you can see a lot of them have their sleeves cut off of the t-shirts. Yeah, very much the same thing, but it was really quite beautiful. So he remembered the collective activities, and he also remembered that they would have the school kids bust out to where the railroad tracks went through, because the Orient Express went right through the country, and they didn't want people to know how desperate and poor they were, and there was all this abandoned farm equipment. So they would take cloth and they would throw it over like old rusty farm equipment. And so he remembered two things: the power of working in large groups, and this idea of covering something to hide it, but at the same time, it really just draws more attention to it. So this idea of curtains and what's behind the curtain, and those were things that sort of percolated around in his head. My personal favorite of his projects was the surrounded islands. I think this was the most beautiful. From Miami, there were 11 islands. It ran for more than a mile, quite a long time. These were spoil islands in Biscayne Bay, meaning they were not natural islands. They were created when they dredged the bay and just piled stuff up to make these islands. And he turns them into sort of giant lily pads. It took, usually you see 3 or 4 years span on his pieces, when in fact, they're only exist for 2 weeks, but it takes 3 or 4 years, number one, to get all the approvals. But by the mid 80s, he was well known enough that actually he was invited by the Miami Chamber of Commerce to do this piece. Usually he has to go begging for permissions. He still had to run environmental studies. They had to do one for land and one for the ocean to do this. before this could be done.
Is that fabric or something?
It's pink material. It's pink fabric. It's very much, it's a little more porous fabric because the water, I'll show you some close-ups and you can see how it actually sits just below the water level. Here's a distant view. The helicopters they were doing helicopter tours through the whole thing, and people were worried because of all the helicopters in the air.
They keep it in place.
Well, there were floats. I'll show you the detail. This is one of the drawings. This is one way he raised money. He would do drawings like this that would be exhibited and sold to help raise like the millions that it would take. And he was pretty good at raising millions by this time and enlisting volunteer help from the arts community. I mean, when they came here, you know, they got all the art students, everybody involved in the arts as volunteers. Everybody wants to volunteer. There are people who are Christo groupies. I know people that will travel anywhere in the world to work on a Christo piece. My teacher was like that. I think he worked on most of the Christo pieces, ended up writing a book on him. But you know,
That looks like foliage. Is that foliage on the island?
yeah, that's an actual island. That's the
Oh,
island.
okay.
Here's a close-up photo that shows them as they're being put out.
So it is stuff growing on it
Yeah, it's an island that has stuff growing on it.
from debris, though.
It's debris. In fact, they were mostly filled with junk and you know, old beer cans from kids that rode out for parties and things like that. They weren't like nice places, and they weren't natural islands. They were a mess. So they, you know, cleaned up all the islands and then did this temporarily. So they actually had to figure out the system. It took a while to figure out how to do this, and they practiced. 2 weeks before this went up, they practiced wrapping key largo. So there was, you know, for a while, all this stuff was around key largo, but they worked out a way to use these floats. These are big, heavy floats on the outside that are weighted down, that hold it in place. And then they figured out how to they use like inner tubes or shallow things you float on, anything that could float, and they unroll them from the outside to the inside. So I've seen pictures of like all these hundreds of people on these little floater things like floating over, because this is actually below water level. It's slightly below water level. So you can actually float on top of the pink fabric to pull it out and into place. But, you know, the image that it created was really beautiful. I think it's more beautiful than anything he had done before. So that was Christo. I just want to talk briefly about conceptual art. I don't want to get into it too much and be a downer because it gets really complicated. And I did put some excerpts from what Joseph Kosuth's writings. Joseph Kosuth is another of my heroes, along with Marcel Duchamp. He is, in fact, the man who discovered Marcel Duchamp and the importance of what Duchamp was doing early in the century, and he gives him credit for that in his writings. He's part of a group known as the Art and Language Group, who were conceptual artists who were really trying to move art from being totally away from just the idea of a thing you make to a new emphasis on the ideas themselves. And he's very influenced by semiotics. Semiotics was really huge in the 80s. Again, it was pretty big in the 90s too, throughout the 90s, come to think of it. Semiotics is a study of signs, and it's again from philosophy, linguistic philosophy, and it's a way of thinking about knowledge. It's a way of thinking about how we know what we know. And it's a philosophy that reveals how complex knowledge is, how complicated it is in terms of how we take meaning from the world. And I'm not going to like read all this stuff and go into it, but basically the philosophy of semiology deals with what it calls signifiers and signifieds, and together they create signs. So there's a lot of critical writing, and not just in art. You know, you find it in social criticism, literary criticism, all sorts of things by the 90s. The signified is the idea. Basically, this is an interpretation of Plato's conception of the ideal. Plato wrote about the ideal, and to Plato, the ideal form is the one that exists in your mind. I can have in my mind an ideal table or concept of table, and then this real table is just an imitation of this table that I'm touching. I'm not going to say real, because to Plato, this wasn't real. The real is in my mind. This is an imitation of it. If I draw a picture of a table, that's another imitation. So all forms in this world of the table are nothing but imitations. This is why he argued that artists shouldn't be making art based on looking at things in the world. They should be base it on what's in their mind. This is the origin of the ideal. Ideal means it comes from an idea. That's what the word ideal. Ideal doesn't mean perfect, like the ideal thing. It means the thing in your mind. You're taking it from your mind. This is, if you're studying Greek art, that's what Greek art was about. That's why Greek art doesn't look like any real people or real things. It's the perfect form in the mind. So all of these things, this is if the signified were the concept stop, think of all the different ways you can signify that. So the signifier is all the different ways to communicate this ideal thing in my mind of stop. I could say the word stop. I could write the word stop. I could hold up my hand. I could look at an octagonal form. I could look at now the circle with the line through it. All of these things are signifiers for this signified stop in my mind. So that's where it begins. That's the language of semiotics. And his most famous piece is 1 and 3 chairs, where we have what we would consider an actual chair, a photograph of a chair, and a dictionary definition of a chair. Now, which is the real chair? Well, none of them are the real chair. They're all signifiers of the ideal. Now, this is a good example of conceptual art, because those objects are not artworks. He would never claim that that chair or that photograph or that dictionary definition is a work of art. The work of art is happening in your mind when you look at these, and it takes your mind to thinking about how you interact with the world and how you know and understand the world. That's conceptual art. And this is sort of one of the more extreme ends of conceptual art. These are very intelligent people, and art and language is very influential for quite a while in the 80s and the 90s. That's conceptual. But I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on other conceptual art. So it's not about the object. It's not about the object making. It's about the idea entirely. Now, confronting socio-political issues. You might expect the most expressive art is going to come from Germany. If you've been with me for several courses, we've seen it going back to the Middle Ages. German art is expressive. So it's not surprising that that's where we're going to find expressive art again. And I just want to look briefly at a couple of things by Anselm Kiefer, who's certainly one of the most important artists working today. Kiefer's, again, probably not the last decade or so much. I sort of haven't kept up, but certainly in the 80s and the 90s, Anselm Kiefer is extremely important. Kiefer was born in 45, and that's really important. He's born right at the end of the war, and all of these artists are born either right at the end or shortly after. They're a generation who grew up not hearing much about art, not hearing much about the war, because the Germans didn't want to talk about the war. But when they reached a certain age, they began asking questions. By the 80s, you've got a generation of German artists, and by the way, a generation of Japanese artists also, who are asking questions that their parents don't want them to ask. And that's where this comes from. He really felt that there was something wrong with German culture, and it was never going to get fixed until people talked about what happened in that war and their role in that war. And there's a movie on this topic called The Nasty Girl. It's a German film, and I can't remember the date of it, but it's not that old. It doesn't go back. It's more recent. And it's really, really good. If you can ever find it, it's around here and there. And it's about a young woman in Germany who was a journalist, and she started, she went back to her little hometown and starts asking questions. What did you do during the war? What was happening? And they called her the nasty girl because she wouldn't let it go. And they kept saying, that's over, forget about it. And anyway, it's a really good film, but it's very much about this phenomenon that was very prevalent at the time. The Nasty Girl. The Nasty Girl is the name of the movie. It's a German film, but I think it's subtitled or whatever. And I don't remember the date, but it's not that old. I mean, it's in the 2000s. When is it?
1990.
Oh, 90. Oh, well, see, boy, that's pretty bad when 1990 isn't that old. That seems fairly recent to me.
Yeah.
Watch it on Prime for $2.99.
Yeah, geez. 90, yeah. Okay,
Amazon.
yeah, you can get it. Okay, good. Kiefer began, he was working in Germany, making these massively huge pieces that really were made to confront the Germans. This is called Heath of the Brandenburg March. I don't have the dimensions on it, but it's freaking big. It's like big as a wall over here. These are massive, and they're very physical. There's a lot of material on there, thick material, sometimes tar. He would often use a blowtorch and torch the surface. So it's very, very physical in your face. Now, the title, Heath of the Brandenburg March, well, the Heath is just the big open plain. The Brandenburg March is a reference to a German marching song that was always played when Hitler spoke. And there are other words on there in German that are very aggressive, and it's meant to be very much in your face. You could imagine this was very controversial in Germany. Germans didn't want to see these things in their face, and everything about it was aggressive. Critics were saying, he's like reenacting the Holocaust on the surface of the canvas. It's aggressive and it's burned and there are things thrown on it. Some of them have big things stuck to the surfaces of them. Now, works like this are, number one, hard for us to really understand because it's not to us. This is very specifically for German culture. We wouldn't understand it and get it in the same way that they did. And also, we didn't know about this. There was a real bias in the art world after World War II. And certainly, when we were studying art, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that everything we studied was like American, and it was like Europe's not even happening. When the Europeans went home, we forgot about Europe, and it did take a while for them to recuperate, economically. But there really were European artists working for a long time, and Kiefer's one of the first that we rediscovered. I remember when Kiefer first had his first exhibition in this country. It was at the Chicago Art Institute, and I was in grad school at the University of Illinois, and we used to go up. So we went up to see that show, and we were totally blown away. It was so different from anything we were used to. We weren't used to anything this expressive, anything this big, anything this powerful. We were used to pop art, basically painting, which is very emotionless. It's not personal. There's nothing visceral about it. You don't feel anything about pop art. You weren't meant to. It was very kind of cold. It was very much like Warhol's personality. But this idea that art could be, wow, aggressive and emotional really took this country by storm. And we were shocked when we saw his works. I want to talk a little bit about this format that he's chosen. He's using one-point perspective. That's a design, a way of designing a scene that goes back to the Renaissance, where you have this one little point right in the middle and everything converges there. It's actually an extremely powerful compositional device, and they understood that in the Renaissance. As a viewer, it literally just draws you right there. You don't have a choice where to look. You look at that point because everything is drawing you there. It's really controlling. And he's using that to comment on German culture. It's a very sort of one point of view. He always felt that German culture was too driven by sort of single-minded focus, that it was sort of too intense to follow the leader to that point. So that this sort of controlling composition was very intentional and very much a part of what he's depicting. And then the other work I want to talk about is a work that's in St. Louis. If you ever get to the St. Louis Art Museum, to me, it's the most important work they have. It's called The Breaking of the Vessels. Kiefer was very influenced by Jewish mysticism, by the Kabbalah, by a lot of different things. And this is it sort of all comes together in The Breaking of the Vessels, which takes up a whole room, as you can see, and there's broken glass all over the floor, so it's sort of roped off, and it's all these sort of burned forms. The story is related to the Zimzum, which I mentioned last time, coming from the Kabbalah, which is a story of creation where God contracts to a single point. Well, also as part of that story is that when that happened, 10 divine emanations, as they're called, the Sephira, were caught in these glass vessels at the time of the Zimzum, and they were unable to contain God's light, which was too much, and so they shattered or were displaced. 6 of them broke, but 4 of them remained mostly intact. And the Sephirot, as they're known, are values. They're archetypal values from which the world was created. And in the story, the vessels that were broken were held values, spiritual values, moral values, aesthetic values, and material values, and they're in desperate need of repair. We need to repair those values. The values that were not broken, what we still have, we have will, we have wisdom, and we have understanding. And with those 3, we should be able to reconstruct the values that we lost, spiritual values, moral values, etc. So it's a very powerful story, and it's told symbolically here, and there are names written on there. There are words of the different Sephirah. These are like burned books, and he has a number of others that deal with burned forms and books, which also deal with issues of the Holocaust. And the broken glass is also a reference to Kristallnacht, right? The night, it was in November 38, when glass and windows was broken of Jewish businesses and homes all over Germany. So there's a sort of reference to that, as well as the broken vessels. So it's a powerful work, and there's a lot more that I could talk about if you want to research it. There's plenty of information online for the symbolism, but this is a really good example of a postmodern work. It's every medium you could think of. I wouldn't call it traditional sculpture at all. It's a construction, an assemblage, but there's paintings, there's text, there's everything you could think of. Anything goes in order to communicate the message. Do what you need to do. Don't worry if you're not a pure painter or a pure sculptor or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's about the message. Also, confronting social politics. Judith Bacca's the Great Wall. Who's heard of the Great Wall of Los Angeles? This is becoming one of the major works of art in this country. It started out small. It says there 76 to 83, but the fact is it's still going on, and there are plans in the future. There was this massive sort of concrete drainage trench, sort of like the LA River, which is not a river, sort of like Brush Creek, which is not a creek. They're basically big drainage ditches with concrete sides. And she managed to get some funds through local community to start painting this mural of scenes of California history. But it's not the California history you usually read. It's the California history of those people who aren't usually in history books, of Native Americans, Hispanic peoples, African Americans, all sorts of people telling their histories. This is just one scene that tells about the division of the barrios. This is when it's very much like, from what I heard, I wasn't here at the time, what happened when they put in 71 and cut right through the Black communities, separating. That's what happened in LA. It was very much like that, and it went through the Latino communities, and so that's what it's referencing here, splitting up families and splitting up people. But the scenes are structured sort of decade by decade, which is why it's going to go on. It's about a mile long now, and it can go on a lot farther than that. There are plans now to extend it, more decades. It usually works with schools and park districts. And so the painting is really done by young people in the community. They're in the process of building bridges sort of over it so you can walk along and see it better. There are all sorts of plans for more things. It needs constant upkeep. It's been flooded, if there's torrential rains, it'll get flooded. So there are plans being set in place for sort of continuous updating and restoration. So it's something that I think is becoming more and more important as part of the piece. It's also now listed since 2017, the National Register of Historic Places, which is going to help get it, a kind of standing where it can be taken care of. But it started as something small and it's grown to something really huge as a work. So it's also confronting political issues. They don't hold their punches when they speak about things that have been done and things that are being done. So a really important piece. Identity. Identity is an interesting thing to talk about. We've had self-portraits. Identity is one thing, but identity in a global environment like this is something else altogether. One of my favorite artists working in this way is a Japanese artist, Yasumasa Morimura. And Morimura deals with identity, not so much on a personal level, but on a cultural level, on a grand scale, inserting himself, and that's him, by the way, inserting himself into iconic images of Western culture. And in doing so, he not only speaks about gender and gender identity, but also, particularly in Japan, the sort of absorption of Western culture, particularly American culture. The Japanese are obsessed with American culture, and they're embracing it wholeheartedly. So it's an Asian perspective on this dialogue on identity and sexuality, critiqued in Japanese culture, Japanese society, and its relationship to Western society. And they're fascinating images. He also speaks on a lot of sort of feminist roles and ideals of sort of the female figure as the object of the gaze, as people, gazing at you. That's another whole theoretical issue. This is Morimura as the Mona Lisa work. So, he's interested in beauty, he's interested in conceptions of beauty in Eastern and Western. What's interesting is when you look at them, we know the iconic image of Marilyn, we know the iconic image of the Mona Lisa, but you do see an Asian face there. And when you look at it, there's a reference to that Asian face. He could have, put anything in there, but it's that East meets West, that Asian face, which is part of it. So that's part of what you think about as well, and how you see the piece. I called it a conversation with culture, because that's what it really is. He's looking at Japanese culture. There's, in the same way that Kiefer's work speaks differently in Germany than it does in America, Morimura's work is going to speak differently in Japan than it is in America as well, or anywhere else. So it's a cultural appropriation. What's interesting is, he's appropriating, an image that Duchamp already appropriated, and so much of what we've talked about today is rooted in Duchamp, who's really the first conceptual artist to give us artist concept, to give us image appropriation, to show us the power of appropriating an image, not just as a found object, but as an image. And both of those are in there. And people have also talked about his Mona Lisa having aspects of his own facade in there as well. I love this very famous image of Einstein that he appropriates. But my favorite is this. This is Yasumasa Morimura, the Japanese face on one of the most famous self-portraits ever made. And I'll show you that this is Dürer's self-portrait from 1500. And I spend a lot of time talking about that when we cover Western art, because that's a very important painting. It's a German artist early in the Renaissance, commenting about the nature of art making in Germany versus Italy. Dürer was making very important statements about himself as a creator, about himself as an artist, and how he wanted to be respected. Artists were not respected in Germany at that time. They were still being treated like craftspeople. Germany had not totally entered the Renaissance yet, but Italy had, and he had been to Italy. He'd seen artists treated as creators, as important people. And so he's making this to make some very important statements. And so Yasumasa Morimura is taking that image and appropriating it for himself. And now we've got another artist appropriating an artist who was already appropriating ideas to, it's this conversation. It shows you how postmodern art is about art. It's about conversations with things that have happened before and how they relate to things that are happening now. I love this complexity and multi-layering of postmodern art. Cindy Sherman, I decided to skip. I don't want to, because I want to get, there's not a lot of time left, and I want to get to some of these global artists. Globalism has changed the art world quite profoundly, and I want to just say a few things about Ai Weiwei, because he should always have people say things about him. He's one of the most internationally known artists working today. Who's familiar with Ai Weiwei? He is a Chinese artist who has I have such a deep respect for this man who has struggled so much. He has been harassed, he has been beaten, he has been imprisoned, he has had his studio bulldozed down, trying to shut him up. I'm still amazed they've just left him alive. He's just such an international figure by this time. I don't think they can kill him, but if they could, they would have a long time ago. But he's just fearless. I wouldn't have the courage that he has. He's followed everywhere. Every photograph you've ever seen of Ai Weiwei, you see a soldier behind him, like following him everywhere he goes. But it's also a good example of what's happening in China now. If I had a couple of hours, we could talk about China, art in China. China is like the biggest mess you've ever seen. They don't know what the hell's going on. They don't know what they want to censor. They don't know what they don't want to censor. There are artists who are far more politically aggressive than Ai Weiwei, who are completely left alone. He really doesn't make that much aggressive political art, and yet they're all over him. And it has more to do with his family, his position at the time of Tiananmen Square. He has this label, political. And so whatever he does, it's going to be treated really harshly. And I'll just look at a couple of his things.
Still recovering, I guess is my word, from the Cultural Revolution.
It's still, yeah, recovering and
They still don't
like they want to be capitalists, but they don't want to give up the totalitarian hand to do it. They want both. They want that totalitarian hand they had with the socialists, but they want a free market, but they don't want to let it be free.
I was listening to something about the music in China just today. The same
Some more.
Same but different, where it was totally wiped out with the Cultural Revolution, and now it's the thing to do.
It's also got to do with their long imperial history. They don't know how to function without an emperor. That's the thing. And Mao was just another emperor without the title. And now they've got these guys, none of them were Mao. They don't have that one strong voice. So the power is very fluid there. And it's kind of a mess. Just a couple things. Here's one from 2009, got him in a lot of trouble. If you remember, The earthquake, the 2008 earthquake in Sichuan, where this school collapsed and all these children were killed. It was a big, thing in 2008, but there was a lot of scandal, political corruption surrounding it and all these things. So merely speaking of it was seen as political. And in this, remembering from the backpack series, in this particular one, there are, I don't know how many, 9,000 backpacks he used. I don't think they're all on this wall, but I don't know. And so there are children's backpacks everywhere. It's called Remembering. And the text, somewhere I have my notes, the text, what it says there, it says, she lived happily for 7 years in this world. And that's all you had to say to be political. It's not saying anything about corruption. It's not saying about the government, but that was enough. So he showed it in Munich. After that, he was arrested in Beijing after this and spent 81 days in jail without being charged with anything. This is his most recent large-scale piece, the sunflower seeds. This is in the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern in London. This Turbine Hall is this is the new thing in museums and galleries, is building one great new space. There's so much contemporary art that's massive that needs this. So the Turbine Hall is their new monumental space. And it was up for several months. It's called Sunflower Seeds. And it was made, the sunflower seeds, this is a space, but here's what you're seeing. Those are not actually sunflower seeds. Those are individual handmade porcelain seeds. 1600, he went to the Jingdezhen, which is the region, the primary ceramics center of China, has been for hundreds and hundreds of years, and employed 1,600 master porcelain craftsmen to make these seeds. And I'll show you here, they're being hand painted pieces of porcelain. And so much of this speaks to China. There are over 1 million of these seeds. It speaks to the individual versus society, the masses of the Chinese, just that they are porcelain and that he used these people really speaks to Chinese history and that tradition of ceramics. Also, Mao was referred to as the sun, and people as the sunflowers turning toward Mao. So the Chinese would recognize that reference as well. Seeds signify maybe a new beginning, the sheer scale, the population. So it's really like posing questions about China and references to China and its piece. It's absolutely magnificent. You can go online actually at any auction site and find people selling these seeds. He actually was selling, you weren't supposed to steal these, but people did. And it wasn't, I don't think they let people walk on it for very long. I think they did for a while, but then I think.
Is this people walking on it?
Yeah, they're just walking on the millions and millions of those little porcelain seeds, lying down, taking naps, apparently.
And they're not secured?
No, they were, at least for a while, were allowed to. But like I said, I think they stopped that after a little while. And I guarantee you, people stole those seeds and just grabbed that little handful or two. But there were plenty of them. But you can now buy them legally. I think he put a bunch of them up for sale. So that's his latest big piece. And I have to, Alfredo Jar, don't want to miss him because he is one of the most important artists working today, and not that well known outside of the art world. But if there's anybody you want to like follow, whatever, it's Alfredo Jar from Chile. He has dedicated his life to exploring on an international scale. I mean, he is a globalist by all means. Questions relating to genocide, murder, poverty, power imbalances on a global scale. He works in a lot of different ways. Most artists don't just work in one medium today. He does film, photography, installation, and probably his most famous project to date is the Rwanda project, which has over 20 different works of art on a global scale. And, you know, he had to sit down, like, how do you deal, what we're talking about this, we're talking about the massacres that took place in 94 that tore Rwanda apart, the conflicts between the Hutu and the Tutsi, where you had massacres, thousands of people massacred in horrible ways. And he's dealing not so much with that it happened, but that how the world responded, or more actually didn't respond to what was happening. And that's what it's really about. And so he said, you know, he didn't want to just have like piles of images of bodies, because one of the things he's doing is indicting journalism as well, and particularly photographic journalists, in terms of what they do, which he thinks mostly just feeds into the stereotypes and the like. So he doesn't want to show bodies. He wanted to take it down to one real level, one person, this one woman, Gutete Emerita, what she went through, what she suffered, and her eyes to look into is part of it.
How big is that? Sorry, how big?
That's a good question. I'm honestly not sure. I'd have to look that up. I'm not really sure because I don't have that in my notes. But he also wanted to, you know, he visited the site where men were killed. She watched her husband and sons being murdered. She did manage to escape with her daughter. And many of them deal with her lives, with announcements. Some of them are video spaces. We wish to inform you that we didn't know. And there's a whole series of pieces like that that you can see. That's Clinton on the scene there, where he's doing his apology. He did a formal apology in '98, where basically, you know, all the world claimed they didn't know. And yet he has recordings. A lot of this are playing the radio recordings at the time where it's being said, like, people knew this was happening. I remember when the news was coming out. You got the news that it was happening. And I think what's most important about Alfredo Jar is not this particular piece, although it is, it's that this is a role for art today. I mean, the possibilities for art, when you think about what we saw in the modern era, what modern art was largely about, it was very insular. It was about a very few little ideas. And it certainly didn't deal with the incredible breadth of the postmodern world. Now, that can be chaotic for many people. I can't tell you the number of journal articles that were published in the 1970s titled things like "Painting is dead, art is dead." It was all doom and gloom, partially because we lost that center. We lost that single voice that told us what art should be, that told us what was good and what was bad. But a lot of people then said, women were saying, African Americans were saying, what's the big loss? You know, we weren't in the conversation anyway. We didn't lose anything. You know, a bunch of white men lost something, maybe, but we didn't. We have many more voices. It is true that we've also lost art criticism, because there is no way to judge and value art in any sort of universal way today. There are many, many different voices and many, many different groups. And often within small groups, you can judge whether a work was successful or not based on what the artist was trying to do. And do you believe the artist accomplished that goal? But we do not have universal checklists anymore. And for people who wanted universal checklists, they're going to feel lost. They're going to feel like they're flying floundering in the art world today because we don't have those things. But you're getting other things in exchange for that loss. You're getting many more voices and many more opportunities. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the future. But what used to be seen as a loss is kind of now seen as a gain. And I think there are enough options and opportunities to speak today that art has opened its doors in ways that it never had throughout, thousands of years of art. And I think globalism is only going to become more and more important as we have no art centers anymore. And I honestly think America's falling behind. I think American art is not addressing global issues the way other artists around the world are. And we're being left behind because we're not saying that many important things. That's my view anyway. Does anybody have any questions?
Do you think that it's becoming more a social issue as opposed to the pretty picture on the wall?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've moved away from the object. That's what conceptual, that's what Marcel Duchamp did for us. He began making those first steps away from the object. It's not that postmodernism allows anything, including modernism. It's possible to still make beautiful things to hang on the wall, but we know now that's just one voice of many possible things you can do, but you still can do that. It's not like we've rejected it. We've just added a bunch more things to it. You can absolutely still do that. That's part of art. It's just that it's not the only thing anymore. You don't have to do that.
What I think I'm saying that the social issues enter into it that weren't there in the past.
There were different social issues and there were the social issues that a small group of people thought were social issues. Now it's like open.
We've always been politically, most people don't want to get involved internationally. They get us into 2 wars, but.
Right. There's always been that. Yeah, America's been that way.
Is it more now than it used to be in the art world? Was there ever a time when we were pretty international, except maybe right after the war?
We were never international like we are because we didn't have the ability to communicate internationally or travel internationally. We didn't know that much about outside the country most of our lives, right? I mean, it's the internet that's really opened up. As much as it's brought us horrible things, it's also opened us up internationally to be knowledgeable about what is happening around the world in ways we never were before.
We have horrible social issues in this country. Are
Yep.
the artists doing anything with that?
So, yeah, there are artists doing everything. I mean, I've just randomly picked a few things. So, yeah, there are American artists that are dealing with our social issues, absolutely. And not just African-American artists, women artists, but they're dealing with everything. There's anything you can think of, there's somebody doing it. And that's the postmodern world. And that's what's good about it, and that's what's bad about it, if you're trying to explain it to people, because it's just everything. It's too much. All you can ever do is sample it. And there's more people making art today, calling themselves artists and making a living at it than anyone who ever did throughout all of history. It's massive number of people making art today. Well, that's actually postmodern.
I have a question, Peggy.
Yes.
Two actually. How about, have you seen all the Goldsworthy stuff, at least in the US?
Oh, God, no. There are thousands.
I think we need to organize a tour, a trip, as soon as we think we're safe running around to see all the Goldsworthy.
Go for it.
We've only seen 2.
Yeah, go for it. No, I mean, he has shows and places. There was a show in Nashville in the maybe 15 or 20 years ago where there were a bunch of pieces, but yeah, they're all over the world. So
And the other question is more serious. So postmodern opens up art to all kinds of subjects. That's a loose phrase. But what distinguishes something somebody wants to call art and somebody else says, oh no, that's just decoration?
Nothing. You can call it whatever you want. I don't even like the word art. People make things, they create things, and those things create. I mean, the word art is an elitist term that made sense back when you had a clear definition of what that was. The word has no meaning today. It has no real meaning to me. People make things, and it's irrelevant what they call them or what anybody else calls them. You make something, you create something because you feel like creating something or communicating an idea. And what someone else thinks of it is totally irrelevant, and what you label it is totally irrelevant. I don't like labels. And I've not been comfortable with the word art for a long time. Because
Thank you.
it implies things that I think aren't really true. But, in a way, we kind of have to label things because you can't function in a world if you don't have labels, because that's how we understand the world.
Do you know how to say
What
the
art
class of
books are
people,
good.
the class of all people who want to make anything, or it's easier to say the art?
Well, we kind of do now. Art schools are structured very differently from the way they were 30 years ago, where you had a class in painting and a class in sculpture and a class in this. Now you have a class in global awareness of political whatever, and you can work in any medium you want, but you're dealing with a subject.
I'm leaving this title with this long as opposed to this title.
Right. I mean, even art schools have recognized that it's not the mediums that separate artists anymore. It's the concepts. You're interested in identity as a member of this group. You're interested in politics, but you're interested in this conceptual linguistic thing. So you have a class on that. That's why artists often work in multimedia. Maybe they make films. Maybe they also write books. Maybe they also make paintings. Maybe they also make sculpture out of some temporary material. Artists don't separate themselves by medium anymore. The groups more are ideological groups, ideas that unite people. And all of this has wreaked havoc on the museum world and the gallery world. How are you supposed to deal with temporary art? How are you supposed to deal with something that's not even physical anymore? How do I deal with a sculpture that's made out of chocolate? How do I seriously, some people, that's a notorious eat it, right? It's a nightmare if you're trying to store or restore or handle, because they're still in a world where art is an object, a permanent object, and it's just not like that anymore. So it's chaos.
When Banks sold that painting for what? And then as the gavel went down, it went through a shredder.
AIC, yeah.
Yeah.
I love it.
You remember that?
No, I don't.
Oh my God, it was last year.
Oh, I missed it.
And it was in London, and they sold this thing, it was on canvas, and basically the gavel went down, and then it just went through a shredder.
I love it. I absolutely love it.
I loved it when the penguins came.
But the person who bought it knew that was going to happen, right?
No, nobody knew.
Oh my God.
And that's what I was wondering, I mean, I figured you would know about it. And
No, but I'm going to find out.
how the lawsuit turned out. I mean, I don't know if there's, but
That should be a great subject, law and art.
Oh, I've taught that. I've taught a whole thing on law and art
Oh,
in the 80s. The laws have changed. I mean, I'm not up on it, but it was a big issue in the 80s. Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
that was very interesting.
No, the courts are not going to be sympathetic to that. The courts, no. The art community might vote one way, but I guarantee you the courts are not going to be sympathetic to that.
I don't know if the guys do. I mean, I have no idea.
Well, I guarantee you didn't pay. I would think not. But people have bought temporary pieces. People have bought things that don't have a physical presence. They've paid money for it.
it's not in the book.
maybe you gotta go home with the shred.
But, in the cases I'm aware of, they knew what they were doing. I mean, they understood they were buying a temporary thing. No, that's one I don't know. Anything else, anybody? Okay, everybody, we'll let you go now. We are done for a while. Take the summer off, enjoy yourselves, and hopefully I'll see you in the fall at some point.
Thank
Bye,
you so much,
everybody.
Peggy. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.